Hello, YouTube and podcast listeners. What's up? It's me, Amaxter. We're back with Behind the Mod, episode 3 of Season 2. And for this episode, we have two members of the Sponge Project, Zidane and Inscrutable. Hello.
Good
Greetings
evening,
from down
folks.
under.
So, what do each of you do on the Sponge Project?
I'll start with that one, then I'll let you jump in, Inscrutable. I am the project leader over the Sponge Powered project. I'm actually a part of one of three gentlemen. The other one would be Gabazo and Blood MC. As far as what I actually do, I think probably the better question at this point is almost what I don't do. Um, For the
Docs.
most part, I mean, I handle overseeing the API development where it's going. I handle when we do releases, new builds. I handle when we release new versions of the API, when we do state of sponges. I guess everything that one could really think of where a leader's concerned. And I also do development.
Huh. And you, Inscrutable?
Well, thankfully I've got a somewhat smaller role than Jaden, which he seems to be terribly busy at just about everything. I do the documentation. I started out just helping write the documentation and in fact just arguing for documentation, and somehow I ended up becoming a chief editor very shortly after that. So I'm sort of responsible for not only managing the Sponge docs, but managing the staff that are responsible for the Sponge docs and encouraging people to contribute to the Sponge docs. I also happen to be the bard.
Huh. Well, that's pretty nice. How did both of, or how did, I guess for those, who aren't totally up to speed, how did, what is the Sponge Project in a nutshell?
The Sponge Project, in a nutshell, would be basically what people would think of as the Bucket Project, which used to be pretty much the dominant server mod out there in existence for Minecraft. After the downfall of the Bucket Project, when all of the members of it basically resigned, and everyone knows about the whole drama behind the DMCA, we kind of came together in a channel, was trying to decide what we were going to do. Funny enough, I wasn't even really a part of that at the beginning. Someone kind of just pulled me into it. I had another project that I was doing a lot of work with Inscrutable, and somehow I kind of got swept along this like big tidal wave of people like, what are we going to do? We need a server mod. We need a team that works on them, and somehow I don't even know now. I took over most of the stuff for the project and assembled this awesome team that I have.
Huh. And
Conveniently.
Inscrutable was one of those members that you, I guess, assembled?
That is correct. Inscrutable has, I mean, me and him have known each other for a long time now. He's back. He's been with us back during the days of the Spout project, which was sort of like Bucket. I mean, extended Bucket on the client side. So think of it like Forge, but you didn't actually load plugins or mods in this case on the Spoutcraft client. And then we decided that we wanted to partake in doing our own server, and then that kind of moved into sort of a generic voxel game engine. Ultimately, none of that kind of panned out. It's really hard these days to do up a game engine on your own, even if you have a bunch of people, when it's an open source product. I mean, you're talking something that it generally takes big companies, a team full of people that are paid quite a bit of money to do something like this. So ultimately, that didn't pan out, but all that experience and stuff never went to waste. We decided we'd come around and kick up the Sponge project, and we basically wanted to give everyone something that was like Bucket, but the biggest important distinction between us and Bucket is we wanted to finally bridge that gap that's always existed between the Bucket plugins and the Forge mods. And if I can say so, I would say that we have done that wonderfully.
Yeah, Sponge is definitely you can just see looking at the staff list and who's involved with it. It looks like the Sponge project has a lot of people from all corners of the modded community kind of coming together to basically make this continuation of a plugin API for servers.
Absolutely. And it's been we've been at this coming up to 2 years inscrutable. I think so, 2 years in September.
Very nearly, yeah. I mean, it's more than
Yep.
just plug-in developers. You have to admit, though, I mean, the whole reason that this project is actually going the way it is, and the reason it is actually succeeding, is not just because we have a few devs. I mean, we've got quite a few very dedicated devs, but we've got an entire community surrounding that, including forums and a kind of ethos for the place. People actually
Absolutely.
want to contribute. People want it to succeed. People want to help, and they know that we're all volunteers. We're not being paid to do this.
Yeah, we've really, the Forge community, I would say at this point has welcomed us with open arms. Some of the Forge team members, the most notable one would be Lex Manos. He was actually with us from the start, and over time, he helps us out by getting the PRs that matter to Forge to get those pulled. Generally, he'll give us priority through his process, as well as he's given us guidance. And we have other people throughout the Forge community who make changes on their side to make sure they're compatible with our Forge implementation of the API called Sponge Forge. And it's been amazing how welcoming that they have been to a mod that ultimately is a very invasive mod. I mean, Sponge Forge is a massive product, and it just blows my mind because I would have never thought that they would have been so open to someone like us coming in. And on the flip side, we have done our part by literally making it not only possible but probable to run a big Forge server with mods. And I know the last time I checked on it, back whenever we were doing some serious performance changes with 189, that we had some Forge servers that were running Pixelmon and some other mods, and they were running Sponge Forge, and they had plugins, and they were hitting player counts of close to 200, and they were pushing past 200, and they had all this protection. And this, to me, that's kind of like the dream of having your own game the way you want it, and not necessarily always being limited by vanilla, even with the client restriction of having to run a custom client. When you pull that kind of player base, you can't argue with those results.
Yeah, for sure. And you definitely, Sponge isn't just the API, though that obviously is a huge part of it. You also, one of the big approaches you've taken, you've done a good job of this too, is kind of being very open with the community and having documentation, very good documentation for everything, which I guess that's more kind of Inscrutable's court.
Inscrutable's
What is
been
that?
wonderful
Well, yeah.
about this.
I mean, the community, it certainly did start very open, and it has stayed so. I mean, partly, from kicking at Scrim, we want to release as much information as we can to the general public. Firstly, so that they know what we're up to, and secondly, so that they can help us. I mean, that's really what the core of it is about, because we've got to have the project open so that people can willingly and easily contribute. So it has to be visible, it has to be understandable, there have to be people that they can talk to and discuss the various issues and get their heads around the more complex parts of the API and more complex parts of the implementation, and exactly what our paradigms are for development. And all of that is taking place through the community, and that's a really helpful development. But it was absolutely essential early on, I think, and it's one of the great hallmarks of this project, that we established documentation that described both how to interact with the community and what our rules were, as well as how to actually set up and run the server, as well as actually how to contribute to both Sponge development and to actually make plugins. And all of that has been, it's still not complete and probably never will be, because Sponge is going to keep developing for Gronk knows how long. But it advances this information enough to be able to let people to really directly get involved into it in various ways without having to run around and ask questions or stand at the sidelines for months wondering what's going on. And that's one of the distinctions we've got with some of the more previous projects, which have had somewhat more
yeah, you definitely have an
strict
organizational
enforcement
structure.
policies.
Yeah, and it's just, funny enough, I've sat here and I have been, I guess, let's just call it the chief software architect. I've been the chief software architect over a vast majority of the API, but it's been so long and everyone forgets things. And I even find myself going to the docs. I did that just recently. I went to the docs page because I couldn't remember exactly how the best way to use the scoreboard API was, and I opened right up the docs and I figured out the answer. And I remember reading it, unfortunately, I just don't have the time to do everything, so I don't get the time to go through and read the docs a lot. But whenever I do, I have such a huge appreciation for what Inscrutable has accomplished with it, him and his team,
Well,
as
yeah,
well as the contributors at large, because it's so easy to read. It's clear, concise, and to the point. That's the way it's supposed to be.
I
Hmm.
certainly can't take credit for all of it. I mean, we've had quite a few contributors over the last couple of years, and some of them aren't with us anymore for various reasons too. So, I can't say that I've written anywhere near even half of the documentation. So, I've got to give credit where credit is due to all of the guys past and present who are still writing away at it.
Yeah, it's huge community involvement, and I think that's definitely visible from the outside by design. Another thing, your API, obviously it's not the Bucket API, it's different. So I think that's one reason why it's tremendously important to kind of be very clear, because you don't not only want to attract the modded community or just the core player base like you've done very well. You want to get the plugin developers, you want to get that ecosystem going, and I think since you have a new API. You do really need something like good documentation to get developers started and rolling on it.
Oh, absolutely. The one of the biggest advantages I think that the Sponge API has is it's really a fresh start. At the beginning, some of the ideas that were used were ones that were very much influenced by the way Bucket was. And don't get me wrong, I'm not one to, maybe at some point in the past, a lot of us were, but at this point, I have grown a huge appreciation for what Bucket accomplished. Ultimately, if Bucket wasn't here, then we wouldn't be having this conversation today. None of this would be happening. So I have a huge appreciation for what that project accomplished. The problem is I think it got to a point to where even if that project would have continued, ignoring some other teams that are keeping it going right now, but let's say if it continued in the kind of development steps that you've seen in the past, is the API was never actually designed for the modern Minecraft. And what I mean by that is the base game has had structural changes. 1.8.9, that entire family is a good example. Or back in 1.7, that was also another good example. 1.9 is a good example. All of these, each and every time Mojang does heavy changes to the game as a whole. And from what most people have saw is that whereas Bucket will be updated, it doesn't quite actually reflect those changes. Um, but even in itself, though, that's actually kind of an advantage because that means that ultimately the APIs always feels really stable. Sponge API, I have made it clear from the get go with this community that we are very much dynamic. Uh, for example, let's say tomorrow that they change something about, let's go back to scoreboards, change something massive with it. Changed how you put scores in it or added something completely new. And the only way we can add support for it is break the API. Well, that would be exactly something that we would do. We won't do it during a version, we'll wait till the new one, but we'll bump what we call an API revision, and then that new API revision will ultimately break prior plugins, which to a lot of server owners is admittedly annoying, but ultimately it keeps our API modern for the way Minecraft is moving. It is a very much a good representation of what you can actually do with the base game.
Right. So server owners are not going to be able to use a plugin from 1.8 on their 1.10 server very likely because it's a different version of the API. But you're saying the benefits of that outweigh the costs.
Well,
Actually,
that
they
it really
might work.
depends.
I mean,
Yeah, it really depends upon what they're actually doing. Because I can tell you right now that if I had to throw a percentage of it, of all the Sponge plugins that we currently have, between 1.8 and 1.10, maybe 5% of them broke, and that might be a rather high number. And that's because when Sponge API was designed, we designed it in mind that this may change one day. For example, the data API, which is such a massive portion of Sponge, which goes with getting all sorts of block data values, tile entity data, attributes, all that sort of thing. It was designed in mind that should Mojang ever add something new to one of these entities, the data API will never change. Your plugins will never actually break. The only time they would is we, for whatever reason, renamed like a key that you're using to access some data. And you'll find that across the entirety of the Sponge API that we have made these decisions. We have painstakingly went back and forth almost to the point of shouting at each other in our faces of making sure that the changes we're doing not only are completely compatible going forward for future versions, but almost more importantly, do they work with mods? Are they compatible with mods? And we have most certainly accomplished this goal.
Yeah, well, one of the big problems with Bucket was, for example, all your build craft and mechanism, all your machines, or whatever, your mods, protections, or just certain plugins, they would not recognize that at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we can see that benefit. That's an obvious benefit of Sponge with regards to modded. What benefits do you kind of foresee happening with vanilla?
Well, we have a number of benefits. It's no secret that Spigot and by association projects like Paper, which are branches of Spigot, are very, very performance minded. And we knew going into Sponge that we needed to first get an API that fits, mostly everyone's needs. And if not, then obviously we can definitely look about adding whatever people need. So that was step one. Step two is we need to look into making the API work, which at this point, the majority of Sponge API is implemented. And now step three is we've got this product. Now we need to make it fast. And
Yeah, we
that's
started
something
adding
that we have.
optimizations as well early on too. I mean, we've had the
Yeah,
entity
that is
range.
true. I mean, we've added them as they go along. But here recently we started getting very serious about it. What can we do to the base game to fix a lot of the performance issues that servers have? The person that's been leading that is Blood, who, as I mentioned at the start, is a fellow leader of the project. And we have looked into all kinds of things that can be done. We've actually consulted with the paper people. We have a really good relationship with that team. Some notable members are Icar, who did a lot of the paper performance patches. He sits in our channels and we talk with him and we ask him, what from paper would have the biggest net benefit? What can we pull over? And he'll give us one of his patches and we'll throw it right into the core and see how it works. We'll make sure it works in mods, of course, but that's how we do it. That's how we generally do it. Not only that, but we've been started looking at some things of our own. We've been starting to do the same thing that the Spigot and Paper guys do, which is pull open a profiler and take a look at the server and see what is slow and see what we can do to make it faster. And
How
I
many
would
things
say
we can
that
offload to
we've
being asynchronous?
that is correct too. We have started looking into making aspects of the server asynchronously. And after the Minecon event, we will probably start revealing a lot of what we've managed to accomplish on that front, which I think a lot of people will be very interested to see what kind of games we've done.
Huh.
Um, and it's been a give and take with the paper project. There's been some things that we found that they have not have, and we kind of poke them about it and see if they're going to put it into their own project. We're not about saying that, oh, you need to use Sponge, and if you don't use Sponge, then we don't want to have anything to do with you. This project has always been about tearing down those silly concrete walls that have been basically set up between these projects, because ultimately it's always been about the community. It's never been about whose project is the best and whose one you need to use.
Yeah, and I think when you have this dynamic approach to development, it again we're kind of back to the documentation. How do you pitch that? I guess to plugin developers and server owners. This one might be aimed a little more towards Inscrutable. What do you, I guess, tell them to kind of how do you pitch? Hey, this API has changed. It's a lot better. You really should update to it.
Actually, we get quite a lot of people to come onto the Sponge channel for the first time for various reasons, and sort of have almost no idea that it's even a different project. So we can just sort of point out and say, look, well, the closest comparison is probably Cauldron. I mean, the Cauldron project, which Blood MC himself maintained for a while before, jumping ship and coming to Sponge, is a pretty good indicator of exactly what you can come to see from Sponge. I mean, this is something that people are familiar with, and they can immediately say, well, okay, Cauldron's no longer available for the current versions of Minecraft, but we've got this, and it works better. So in that sense, we've already got something that a lot of people can say, oh, okay, well, I've heard of this. I may not have run this project or whatever, but I've got an idea about what to expect and what I can do with it. And similarly, we got the idea with vanilla too, so that we can just have people say, well, okay, I was running Bucket. What have you got that's similar to that? Well, this is Sponge Vanilla, and this will happily run, without having to worry about mods. So if you're not interested in Forge and you think Forge will be a problem for your server, then you can run this instead, and you just get plugins that are compatible for Sponge API instead of Bucket API, and that's it's something that most people can sort of get their heads around. There's been a lot of annoyance, of course, that the great plethora, the backlog of Bucket plugins that from history is no longer functional on Sponge, and this is unfortunate. It's been a real bummer. There was desperate work done to try to make sure that we could make it compatible with Bucket API and make Bucket plugins work. But in the end, that project, Poor, died because it was a monumental amount of work for very little reward. We still could not make a lot of Bucket plugins work because of the fundamental change in paradigms between how Bucket works and how Sponge works. And Sponge, in theory, should be not only more powerful, but in principle also more efficient. I mean, we've still got to get the kinks out of all the systems to make sure that it does demonstrate those principles, but it's already got a pretty good example of exactly how it can do that.
Oh, absolutely too. And it's funny to sit here and think about kind of all those changes that have been made to this project versus coming from Bucket. I think a great example of this is thinking back, Blood, he ported over a project on Bucket. It's pretty popular, called Grief Prevention, which a number of people out there probably know of. And importing it, he mentioned to me that he was looking at the gentleman's class that had a whole bunch of listeners in it. And those listeners were basically handling server protection. And he mentioned that there was I think Blood told me about 40 listeners, roughly, which is not too surprising because Bucket had a whole bunch of events for determining, when block does XY action on the server, which is fine. And when he ported that to Sponge, he was able to lower that listener count from 40 down to 1. And
Wow.
that is because of the fact that, and this has been something in which we worked on probably for about 6 months straight, between about 5 members of this project. We come home, we come on TeamSpeak, and then it was like a council, if you want to think of it that way. And we'd go back and forth on what to do about events. And obviously we had to have events. But we didn't want to repeat kind of like all those events that Bucket had, because ultimately it makes doing plugins incredibly annoying.
Makes the API run
Because you're
fragile
having to
too.
listen. Yeah, I mean, you're having to listen to a ton of events just to do like basic protection. So the one thing that we came up with was we can do really powerful events in which, instead of describing an event as something did something, we can say that, this action occurred on this target. And depending upon what you're looking for, you would check what we call a cause. And that cause is just a container object that would have whatever caused the event. It would have the root source of the event as well as any contextual data. And to put it really in simpler terms, it allows us events to do really the following. And this is a good example, is if you spawn a sheep with a sheep egg, and then that sheep goes nearby and it eats some grass. So when sheep eat grass, you'll notice that they change a block to dirt.
Mm-hmm.
So our API will fire your obvious change block event, which is what we call it. You'll find that in the cause, there is a sheep in the cause, and the sheep is the root source because the sheep is the one that changed the block to dirt. You will also find that the player who owns the sheep is also in the cause, and that player is what we call the owner. You'll also find that if the player is not online, then we will give you the user data for the player. And so what you can do is you can build these powerful queries against the cause object. You can find out if a particular sheep happens to be a sheep that is owned by someone in which your region allows for actions to occur in. So you can allow someone's sheep to eat grass from your region, but for example, I could deny inscrutable sheep from eating grass from my region. And that's really just a small taste of the power that comes when you take a different fundamental approach to how you tackle events. And that kind of goes back to what I discussed with the evolution moving forward to a modern Minecraft API,
Hmm.
because that sort of thing should be entirely possible to do.
But it does mean
And
plugins are going to have to be completely rewritten for that. But on the other hand, it should take less work to do so.
oh, absolutely. I used to develop quite a few bucket plugins. I did it for my best friend. He runs a server in real life. Um, and I did all kinds of plugins for him. So I have an idea of what it's like to write a big bucket plugin. And is the API feels it's not that it feels unpolished. That would not be fair to say. It just doesn't feel modern. It doesn't feel like that someone basically went back and rethought it. And I think that's so important for an API to continually evolve. It feels like it never had a chance to perform that evolution. And that's something in which I think we were given an opportunity by the community as a whole to go out and do and see what happens.
Right. I mean, look at the Minecraft development model. I mean, Mojang doesn't really care if they have to break a few mods to do whatever they
No,
want to
they do
do.
not care at all.
Yeah, exactly. In which, you can complain about that, but that's just how Minecraft works. And to an
Yep.
extent, I think that's how Sponge works. In terms of applications, you mentioned kind of the whole modded Pixelmon example. Obviously, I'm sure we're going to see Sponge, especially with 110, on a lot of, big modded servers. What other applications do you see, like the Mindplexes of the world, the Hypixels? Like, what kind of range of possibilities do you see Sponge being involved in?
That's a really good question.
I'm pretty sure it'll
One of
support
the
a minigames
biggest,
framework.
yep. We're putting together a kind of exhibition plugin in which we'll show at Minecon, which is kind of like a mini game framework or what have you. So that's going to be a really good showing of it. And obviously for anyone that's at Minecon, be sure to come by and stop by our booth and hang out with us and talk and whatnot. Um, but as far as getting the big servers, this is something that we've kind of touched based on in this little chat so far. But Sponge has two implementations. They share a common code base. You heard me mention Sponge Forge, and Screwable mentioned Sponge Vanilla. Sponge Forge is meant to be run alongside of your mods, allows your plugins to be run with Forge, and Forge and mods and plugins can live in harmony with each other. Sponge Vanilla is exactly what CraftBucket is. So if Bucket is to API, then Sponge is to API, and then CraftBucket is implementation, Sponge Vanilla is to implementation. We found when we wrote Sponge Forge originally, because that was our actual target platform for a very long time, we found that we could actually share like 90% of the code with a vanilla implementation. So we created a third project called Sponge Common, and we put these two under one umbrella. This allows us to have the mantra that, and it's the same as Java, so I'm going to just go ahead and steal this from Oracle, but you can write once and run anywhere. In this case, you can write one plugin and you can give it to someone to use with their mods, and then you can give it to someone who doesn't want Forge, and they can run it on their vanilla server, assuming that they just use the Sponge API. And in implementing this API, for those of you that understand the Forge model and how that works, and Spigot as well too, of how they modify the base game to use things called patches, which is they just go in there, change the code, and then it generates patch files. And when they build an artifact for you to run, those patch files get applied. We take a completely different approach. We have a technology that was created by an Adam Mumfrey Smith. He goes by Mumfrey, and he's one of this project's developers.
I think he was
He
interviewed previously
created
here.
what's that, Inscrutable?
I'm pretty sure he was interviewed previously here. I think we've had a
He
SpongeBob
was, yes,
interview. Yeah.
along with
Yep,
Gabazoo.
yep. And so you guys have already heard from him before, but yeah, he created this technology for bytecode engineering. So all of our code is basically fake until runtime, in which it gets applied dynamically to the Minecraft server. Now, one of the things that we have done is we actually allow plugins to tap into the mixin power. We allow them to define their own mixins. So a server like Hypixel is traditionally a very modified server. They might use like Paper or Spigot as a base, but if one was to look at their code base, it would look vastly different because their server is tailored for their unique experience.
They have their own wrappers and everything, and probably a ton of programmers working on all
Oh,
the mini games.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Guys making pretty good salaries too, most likely.
yeah.
Um, so that's all well and good, but there's a couple of issues with that approach. The first one is you have to fork the project, so you have to maintain this fork, which in itself is very annoying. The second thing is that if there's any code in which you may not want to run it, for instance, if you put something experimental in, let's just say something like asynchronously lighting, for example, so an asynchronous lighting engine, and for example, they need to turn it off for whatever reason. Well, all of a sudden now they have to go and they have to either not apply the patch file or they have to strip out the commit. It's very annoying. It would actually, in their case, I'm sure that they'll see the potential in the fact that with using Mixin and using what we call Mixin plugins, you are allowed to dynamically patch code to the Minecraft server. What you'll find if you actually look at a standard sponge config file is there's some optimization section in which if you turn those on, they might actually affect a server that likes forge mods, but ultimately a vanilla server would not care. They would want to have that on.
Huh.
So we allow you to turn this stuff off and on. And if you turn it off, that code literally does not exist. If you were to create an artifact of Sponge and you looked in there, you would see that this code is non-existent, and that's through the power of Mixin. Is that they're able to do these dynamic code injections, and we use it to do the entire implementation. We have so many Mixins, and if you look at it, you'll think it's literally black magic because it looks like it's black magic of how that works. We don't do any patch files. We don't do anything, special to if a mod is installed, only run this code. We don't have to. We don't have to do any of that. I guess I really hate to say this, but it literally just works. And there's a lot of genius behind that technology. And we're hoping that the big servers can look at that and see the kind of advantages that it brings and would be willing to work with us to proceed forward with it.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess what you have here is really a much more flexible, or pardon me, spongy base that people can use. Like, because I mean, people turn Minecraft into all sorts of stuff. On one hand, you have the modded servers that maybe will be a little standard. They'll have their protections. They'll have their townie or factions or whatever. And on the other hand, you have the completely different Hypixels of the world who make their mini games and stuff. And yeah, they can do this stuff. Do you see it being possible that maybe like say Hypixel or whoever, they made a launcher and they have a mod pack and they want to make mini games, like say survival games but with modded weapons or something like that? Do you see that being possible?
That's actually already possible. We have a very in-depth registry system to Sponge. You can query any mod ID with any item/block ID or whatever that they have. We've actually taken great, or I shouldn't say taken, we've went to great lengths with the game registry to make it to where any sort of mod thing can be found. And I had shown, I showed months ago of doing a small plugin in which I basically was replacing like vanilla blocks in generation with mod blocks. And I didn't even need to know the mod. I knew the mod's ID for their block. I looked it up. I set it. Is literally is that simple. So if they want to write mini games in which they're looking for a particular custom block or item from the likes of Industrial Craft, Buildcraft, Pixelmon, etc., they can absolutely do it. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm pretty sure the block I set was the Pixelmon little treasure chest things they have that look like Pokeballs sitting on the field. I changed tall grass to all of that, and it was like literally fields upon fields filled of Pokeballs.
Nice.
and that's just an extremely small part. We make no assumptions with our API on what's available. We have what we call enumeration like classes that have the default what you see in vanilla. So block types.stone or item types.caret, for example. But you can query the game registry for anything that you're honestly looking for. And this goes beyond blocking items too. We have biomes in there,
Yeah.
as well
I
as
have to say, it works very well with terrain control, for example. I mean, terrain control is a bucket
oh
plugin, but it's
yeah,
also a Forge
querying
mod.
generators too. So world generators, because terrain controls a world generator, so we can query it. I showed an example of a sponge plugin querying for a terrain control generator, setting it onto a world, and then I fired a world up with terrain controls generator, and I didn't have to do anything.
Yeah, so
It
you could have like a
just
fully server side world gen or whatever. It kind of really changed up the experience without forcing the client to have to do that stuff.
that is correct. I mean, that goes back to what I talked about of making a modern API and tearing down those walls, because when it comes down to it, plugin dev shouldn't have to give a flip if it's a mod item or not.
Hmm.
And in Bucket had like those material enums, which if any person is a plugin developer from Bucket, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And it was very static, and static in the context that it didn't really ever change. Cauldron did some black magic to inject new material values for mod blocks and items, and it worked, but there was no central system to really look this stuff up, and that's one of the things that we did a very good job in tackling with this API.
You really got experience on that too. I mean, that's one of the things that Spout used to do too, is allow you to
Yep,
add
that is
custom blocks
correct.
using the Spoutcraft client too. That was
Huh.
fun back in the
And
day.
Yeah, it definitely was. That was a long time ago. Gosh, it feels like forever ago.
yeah, I mean server API time. It's crazy. So yeah, like, I guess going back to the community angle, what do you think? Like, having all this modded community and having all this vanilla server community just kind of, I guess, for the first time, sort of combining in this way, what do you think it's going to lead to?
What do I think it's going to lead to? Well, I would hope that it would lead to the vanilla crowd opening up a bit more to the mod side. Because the vanilla crowd has always been hesitant about mods for like two reasons. The first one is, yeah, for the most part, it will require a custom client. It depends upon if the mod does anything that requires client side. So there's actually a number of mods that don't, but most people don't realize that.
Hmm.
The second part is, I think it comes down to the fact that there's no really good way from the Forge side to protect your server. That's been one of the biggest downfalls using Forge, because one has to remember that Forge has always really traditionally been about the single player experience.
Yeah, and
I
mods
mean,
are
they
so
have mod
ingenious.
support, sure. It is slowly changing, and I'm not going to sit here and say that it's been directly as a result of what we've done, but I think that we are a large part influencing that mindset change, to where Forge is moving to how can we better serve multiplayer? How can we better do performance? Because uh, there's no one that can sit here and say that Forge as a server has anywhere near close to the performance that Paper or Spigot does. Because no, it's not even close. And that's a large reason why I think people also want to get SpongeForge on their Forge servers, is because you install SpongeForge and like magic, everything just speeds up tremendously. And that is because we incorporate all that good code that has been done in the past by lots of people from the community, and we pay it forward. When we did this project, it wasn't like, well, all the old code was terrible. We're going to do it all over again and it's going to be better. The way we look at it is there was a lot of good work in this community done on this game. And it would have been a crying shame had we did this API and this implementation and we didn't pay it forward. We didn't bring the work of people like iCar. We didn't bring the work of people like Mike Prim or, gosh, let me think here. There's a whole bunch of them.
SK89Q even.
Yep, SK89Q. He done a whole bunch of stuff for this community.
Oh yeah, the world guy.
Amaranth. Yep, Amaranth from the Bucket team. Another solid person that's done a ton in this community. Um, it just, I mean, if we would have done that, then that would basically been us just saying that the last, let's see, Bucket went for 5 years, I think, something like that, or maybe it was 4 years. I don't remember.
It
That would have
started early
been
2011, so yeah.
okay. So 5 years. Well, close to five. That would have been saying that all those years were for nothing, and that basically all the progress the server community and ultimately part of the client community did, and that entire time was for nothing, and that we're basically just throwing it all away. And we would never have done that. I would have never allowed that to happen. And I'm glad that we were able to bring a lot of that code that was done in the past and basically keep it going forward, along with some of the stuff that we're bringing to the table.
Yeah, that's very exciting, and I guess there's a shift in attitude now. Because you mentioned forge servers. If forge servers up until a few months ago, or very recently, have just been stuff like Forgecraft, maybe small private instances of friends. And we've really only seen this whole sort of large scale multiplayer experience on vanilla servers with Minecraft. And I guess now these worlds are finally colliding, and we're going to see all sorts of interesting stuff. Look, in terms of adoption, what do you see it looking like? Do you think we're going to get a lot of adoption now because we're finally adopting 110 and there's no bucket or any sort of API like that for that version, or sometime in the near future? When do you see that happening?
Well,
Hopefully,
I
when we
don't
can
think
release a
anytime
stable
soon.
version. We're still working on
Yeah.
bleeding at the moment. One of the issues is that Sponge Forge, Sponge in general, is obviously still in heavy development, particularly for API 5, which is aimed at 110.2, and it's not quite stable yet. So I'd say, once we've got a stable release, I suspect we will see quite a bit of adoption, because not only will it, be stable and run well, but run well with a lot of the latest stuff and do things that people really want to do. The uptake of Pixelmon has been phenomenal. There's a lot of Pixelmon servers running Sponge because they find it does things that they want to do. And when they have issues, they're not hesitant to let us know about them too, which is great. So,
Oh,
iron
absolutely.
sharpens
Well, if
iron in that sense.
And speaking on that right there, as far as like a stable build, I mean, we're coming really, really close to doing a stable build for 1.10.2 because we've done a ton of changes to it. I mean, anyone that watches our project will notice that there is a ton of active development. There's very few times in which this project slows down, and we got so many people that are devoting all kinds of time to this to get it where it needs to be. And I would say at this point, the Pixelmon developers, their team itself, they must love us because it almost felt like that within the scheme of 2 months, they went from a popular Forge mod to like one of the most popular pieces of software in the Minecraft community, hands down, because it just exploded.
yeah,
And
that's
it's just, I went and I checked, like, as an example, one night I was curious, I went and checked in on them to see how they're doing, and I went and checked on their. They have a wiki, and what I found is they have the main Pixelmon project, and then they have a bunch of side mods. And what they call side mods is things that add stuff to Pixelmon. For example, one of the side mods is like the GTS, which from Pokemon is the Global Trade Station. It mimics that functionality. And their wiki has the option to search. And I was like, I wonder what I'll come up with. So I typed sponge in that box and I hit enter. And I was blown away. It's like pages after pages of all their side mods. All of a sudden, if you have Sponge installed, these permissions are available, these commands are available, and so on and so forth. And they literally have welcomed us with open arms. They never even questioned it. The moment they seen what we were doing and what could be done, they accepted us. And I think that really goes to show how many people want a modded experience, but a server they can ultimately protect. And with some of the painstaking implementation code we've had to write, with one of our most notorious being what we call the cause tracker, has really allowed modded servers to function just like their vanilla equivalents. The vanilla ones have always enjoyed having a server in which the administrator feels like that he or she could step away for 6 hours to a day to possibly a week at a time, and don't have to worry about coming back to the whole thing being blown to pieces.
Whereas
And the
Forge
Forge
mods are so
servers have
ingenious at
never
getting
been able
around
to do that.
protection.
Absolutely. And so with the cost tracker, the one thing we found out is, Forge mod developers. I mean, they are who they are. They're really no different plugin developers. A lot of times they won't throw the events where they need to, or they figure out how to do something, but they do it in probably, you know, the best word for it is the most asinine way possible. And it ultimately, there's no checks and balances in place. And so with the cost tracker and Sponge, is basically a glorified state machine that keeps track of everything that's going on in the world, and it makes sure that if a Forge mod doesn't fire something as simple as like a Forge interact block event or a player interact event for them. So if a Forge mod doesn't fire that, Sponge will come behind it and it will fire it. And it makes sure that if the event is canceled, then the Forge mod is told and nothing happens. And one of the biggest mods that so many people use that is notorious for not firing any of these events is Thaumcraft. Oh, Thaumcraft. Thaumcraft basically, really appreciate that guy's work and what he's done. But Thaumcraft is most definitely a single player mod. Make no mistake about that. And it doesn't fire really any events. So people could use Magic on a server that I do dev for, which was on 1.7.10. We had Cauldron, we had Thaumcraft, a bunch of other bucket plugins. The bucket plugins were never told about the events. So bucket plugins would be doing what they're supposed to do, doing protection, but Thaumcraft would be like, lol, here you go. I'm going to go blow open your residence. I'm going to go unlock your doors with my magic.
Fill your
Quite
house with
literally
taint.
in this case. Breaking your worlds with taint, and no one wants that.
Mm-hmm.
If you run a server, you want full control. It is what it is. If you're going to play single player, then you would accept it because that's what the game says. But when you have the server, you want that kind of control. And I'll never forget the day in which I did up a video, and it's still sitting on the Sponge forums. I've made a post for it. I did up a video and I demoed the first serious working bits of the cost tracker. And I showed that I printed out that an interaction did occur from Thaumcraft Magic, and I canceled it, and it canceled the magic. And I remember I got a whole bunch of responses from people that were kind of just blown away because we didn't have to go blow down the doors of the developer of Thaumcraft. I mean, he can continue doing what he's doing. Sponge will stop him each and every time.
Wow. Huh. So you just kind of implemented this thing that without the mod, without any sort of need for any other layer, you had a way to stop Thaumcraft from basically being a bad experience on a server.
That's correct, because when it comes down to it, Thaumcraft can do whatever it wants to do, but it still has to call certain methods to get things into the game.
Right.
And if you think about it like that, then all of a sudden you're like, if I instead of trying to make Thaumcraft behave, or trying to ask the developer to do what he needs to do, why don't we use Mixin to put code at certain points in the game and we track what's going on, and then based upon this tracking we can fire the appropriate events and cancel it, and the mod developer can't do anything about it. I mean, they might use some magic ASM to completely override some methods and do completely, I guess the best way forward is to completely redo the engine from the inside out, and if that happens, then at that point, there's literally nothing anyone can do, and you should just remove that mod because they're being stupid about it.
Yeah. Well, I think for most cases, you have a very good, or much better than anything, in the bucket days we could have dreamed of foundation for kind of server owners, which is great. I kind of help run the My Night server, and that's a huge 1.7
okay.
kitchen sink pack. It's a nightmare to maintain in terms of someone has witchery and is a vampire, they can do anything. None of the plugins are listening to that.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, then this solution would be a dream come true for you, my friend.
Yeah, I think me and many other server owners for 1.10, and hopefully plugin developers, because now they can finally I'm sure there's mod developers and both plugin developers, people from both sides who've been wanting this kind of interaction that's possible with Mixins and with all the stuff you have. So yeah, that's pretty awesome. Looking towards, I guess, what do you see what do you see happening with Sponge in the near future in general? Like, you mentioned the adoption, but I guess what are we gonna see? Are we gonna see lots of vanilla servers using Sponge, lots of modded servers, lots of like both? What's gonna happen in the near future, uh, with regards to Sponge?
Well, I think the biggest usages that you're going to have is going to be from the modding community, and we're already seeing this. So that's
Comparable to
just going to
Cauldron.
continue to increase. All the people that were using Cauldron, whatever stragglers are left, they're going to come over sooner or later. Anyone that wants to run a big modded server, they're going to come over as well too. As far as the vanilla crowd is concerned, it's an interesting situation with them because, and it's one I completely understand too. You are approaching some server owners who have literally spent tens upon thousands of dollars building up a server and a set of software that I am now telling them that you should come over to Sponge. Let me list off our tons upon tons of positives,
But you have to
but
rewrite everything.
you'll have to rewrite everything. So you'll have to reinvest, probably not nearly as much money, but you will have to reinvest that time and that effort to do so. I think that over time, it's going to get a lot easier for devs to accept, especially as our software catalog keeps growing. It, the best way I can put it in this case is the hardware never sells the software. It's actually the inverse of that. If you consider us the hardware, then people won't use Sponge unless we have that software in place.
Right.
And the biggest advantages I'm seeing as far as getting that software into place is the fact that we've been so open with the community, we've been so open with documentation, we've been really open to making changes, been really open to hearing new ideas for things to do to the base game, and have been trying to pull in content. I mean, we've been really just overwhelmed with the amount of PRs that we got, with the amount of issues that have been open, with all these kind of avenues for discussion that have been happening. And I think as that continues to increase, even the most diehard of the vanilla crowd is going to have to take a step back and say, do we want to continue using an ecosystem that is, for lack of better words, is in maintenance mode? Or do we want to continue to use an ecosystem that is, that's continuing to evolve?
Yeah, I mean it's all about evolution. That's Minecraft and modding both kind of follow that development model. Why not the server API? I think we're running a little short on time, so I guess we
Okay.
gotta end it close to here. But this has been awesome talking about this. And yeah, thank you both of you for coming on. Been an awesome chat tonight, and I think many people will appreciate this. Server owners, mod developers, just people interested in Sponge and what
Yeah.
it can do.
Try
Oh,
it out,
absolutely.
people.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thank you, all of you guys, for watching or for listening, whatever you do. And see you in the next one. Goodbye.
See ya.